Michael sat against the cold brick wall, his body frozen in place, the last remnants of warmth slowly fading from his limbs. The icy wind howled through the alley, biting at his exposed skin, cutting through the tattered coat he had wrapped around himself like it was nothing. He had lost feeling in his fingers hours ago, and now even the pain was beginning to dull. That scared him the most. Not the hunger, not the exhaustion, but the fact that his body was no longer fighting. It had given up. The streets were alive with the usual city chaos. People hurried past, bundled in thick coats, their breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. Some walked quickly, eager to get home, while others laughed as they huddled in small groups, enjoying the nightlife. None of them looked down. None of them saw him. He had become invisible, just another forgotten soul swallowed by the city's indifference. Once, Michael had been one of them. He had walked these same streets wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, making plans for the future. But the future had a cruel way of unraveling. A sudden job loss, rent payments missed one after another, a bank account that hit zero faster than he ever thought possible. It all led to this. He had tried. Oh, he had tried. But no one wanted to hire a man who had spent months sleeping on the streets, a man who had no permanent address, no clean clothes, no proof that he was still worth something. He had learned quickly that once you fall far enough, the world stops seeing you as a person. His eyelids drooped, the exhaustion pulling at him like an anchor dragging him under the ice. He knew the danger of falling asleep in this cold. He had seen others go that way. One day they would be sitting in their usual spot, wrapped in thin blankets, fighting the chill. The next day, they would be gone. Michael did not want to be one of them. But the fight had drained out of him. The cold was winning. His breaths were shallow now, his chest barely rising and falling. He could no longer tell if his heart was slowing down or if he was simply too numb to feel it anymore. A few feet away, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tires crunching against the snow. Inside, Keanu Reeves sat in the passenger seat, his face partially hidden beneath a wool beanie and a thick scarf. He had been quiet for most of the ride, lost in thought, watching the city blur past. He had always been observant, noticing things others ignored. But tonight, he saw something he could not ignore. The moment his eyes landed on the figure slumped against the alley wall, something inside him shifted. There was something haunting about the stillness of the man, the way his head hung forward, his arms lying motionless at his sides. It was not just exhaustion. It was surrender. Keanu's driver, familiar with his sudden impulses, sighed. "Sir, do you need me to—" "Pull over," Keanu said, already reaching for the door handle. The driver hesitated. "Are you sure?" Keanu's voice left no room for argument. "Pull over." The car slowed to a stop. Before the driver could say anything else, Keanu was already stepping onto the icy sidewalk. The cold hit him instantly, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the man in front of him. Michael barely registered the sound of approaching footsteps. His mind was too clouded, his senses dulled by the creeping frost in his veins. He did not even flinch when a shadow knelt beside him. "Hey!" a voice said, calm and steady. "Can you hear me?" Michael forced his eyes open, the effort feeling like lifting a 100-pound weight. The face in front of him was blurry, just another stranger, just another pair of eyes that would eventually look away. But these eyes did not look away. Keanu studied the man closely. The blue tint of his lips. The frost gathered on his eyelashes. He was running out of time. Michael's cracked lips parted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why?" Keanu exhaled, his breath a thin mist in the freezing air. "Because you need help." Michael did not have the strength to argue. Maybe deep down, a part of him did not want to. He felt a strong arm wrap around his shoulders, guiding him up. His legs barely responded, and for a brief moment he thought he would collapse. Keanu did not let him. "Come on," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's get you warm." The driver had already stepped out to help. Together they lifted Michael into the back seat of the SUV. The warmth hit him like a shock to the system. His body trembled violently as feeling began to return, his muscles protesting against the sudden change in temperature. Keanu climbed into the car beside him. "Drive to the nearest hospital," he told the driver. Michael's head rested against the seat, his breaths shallow but steady. The warmth of the car was pulling him toward sleep, but he fought against it. His mind, sluggish as it was, still could not understand why this was happening. Why, after months, years, of being ignored, someone had finally stopped. "Who are you?" he murmured. Keanu glanced at him, a faint smile on his lips. "Just a guy who saw someone who needed help." Michael's eyelids fluttered. He wanted to stay awake, wanted to ask more questions, but his body had other plans. The last thing he heard before the exhaustion finally won was Keanu's voice, low and steady. "You're going to be okay." Outside, the city carried on, unaware of what had just happened. The snow kept falling, covering the streets, the sidewalks, the alley where Michael had almost taken his last breath. But inside that car, everything had changed. One life had been saved. And it had all started because one person chose to stop. The warmth inside the SUV was suffocating at first, a stark contrast to the deadly chill Michael had been trapped in for hours. His body convulsed in violent shivers, his muscles tensing as the sensation of heat spread through his frozen limbs. His fingers, stiff and pale, twitches involuntarily, pain stabbing through them as blood slowly began to circulate again. It felt like needles piercing his skin. He clenched his jaw, trying to suppress a groan. Keanu Reeves watched him carefully, his face unreadable, but his eyes held something rare, genuine concern. The man beside him had nearly frozen to death, and if he had driven past just a few minutes later, it might have been too late. Keanu knew what frostbite looks like, what hypothermia could do to a body. He had seen it in places most people never would, during charity work, during long film shoots in extreme conditions. But this was different. This was personal. This was someone the world had left behind. Michael barely registered the movement of the car as it sped through the streets, heading toward the nearest hospital. His head leaned against the leather seat, his eyelids fluttering as his body fought against the exhaustion. The warmth should have been comforting, but it only made the situation feel surreal. He had spent so long in the cold, his body on the verge of shutting down, convinced that this night would be his last. And now, suddenly, he was here, inside an expensive car, wrapped in warmth, sitting beside someone who, just an hour ago, was nothing more than a distant celebrity name to him. It felt like a dream. Keanu reached forward, turning up the heat slightly. The driver cast a quick glance in the rearview mirror. "Should we call ahead to the hospital, sir?" Keanu thought for a second before shaking his head. No cameras. No press. He did not need this to become a headline. He had never been the type to seek attention for what he did behind the scenes. This was not about making a statement. This was about saving a life. Michael stirred beside him, his breath shallow but steady. Keanu noticed his fingers twitching, his body still locked in that half-frozen state. He needed to keep him awake. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone casual, as if they were two strangers making small talk. Michael barely turned his head, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael." Keanu nodded slightly. "Michael, that's a solid name." He leaned back, studying him for a moment. "How long have you been out here?" Michael's throat was dry, his voice hoarse when he tried to speak. "Too long." His gaze dropped to his hands, the reality of his situation crashing down on him again. He had nothing, no home, no job, no family was waiting for him. He was just a man who had been left behind. Keanu could see it in his eyes, the weight of it, the pain of being discarded by a world that did not care. He had met people like Michael before, people who had once had everything and lost it all. And he had always believed that sometimes, all it took was one person to change the course of someone's life. Michael swallowed hard, his fingers flexing slowly as feeling returned to them. He shifted slightly, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why did you stop?" Keanu glanced at him, his expression calm but firm. "Because I saw you." Those words hit Michael harder than he expected. Because I saw you. How long had it been since someone had truly seen him? Since someone had looked past the dirt, the worn-out clothes, the hollowed-out expression on his face, and recognized that he was still a human being. Michael exhaled shakily, his body still trembling. "I don't get it," he muttered, his voice laced with exhaustion. "People pass by every day. No one stops. No one cares." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "That's the problem, isn't it?" He sighed, rubbing his hands together. "The world moves fast. Too fast. People don't always see what's right in front of them." Michael scoffed weakly. "They see. They just pretend they don't." Keanu did not argue. He had seen it himself, the way people ignored the suffering around them because it was easier. Because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant caring. The car slowed slightly as they neared the hospital. The flashing red sign was visible through the windshield, cutting through the dark night like a beacon. Michael stared at it, his stomach twisting. Hospitals were places for people who had something left to fight for. What was he doing here? As if sensing his hesitation, Keanu spoke. "We're going in together." Michael's head snapped toward him, his brows furrowing. "You don't have to—" "I know," Keanu interrupted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The car came to a stop, and before Michael could protest further, the driver was already stepping out, opening the door for them. Keanu moved first, stepping onto the icy pavement before turning back to help Michael. Michael hesitated. He was not used to this, to being helped. But something in Keanu's expression told him that this was not a choice. With a deep breath, Michael slowly extended his hand. Keanu gripped his wrist firmly, steadying him as he stepped out of the car. His legs wobbled beneath him, but Keanu did not let go. A hospital worker rushed toward them the moment they stepped inside, taking one look at Michael and immediately motioning for a wheelchair. "Hypothermia?" the nurse asked, her tone urgent. Keanu nodded. He was outside in the cold for hours. Fingers looked frostbitten. The nurse nodded, immediately calling for assistance. Within seconds, 2 doctors appeared, ready to take Michael to a treatment room. He felt the familiar sinking sensation in his chest, that feeling of being a burden. He turned to Keanu, hesitating. "I don't have any insurance. Keanu held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't worry about it." Michael blinked. "But—" Keanu's expression softened, but his tone left no room for argument. "I've got it covered." The words hit Michael like a gut punch. He had spent so long believing no one would ever help him. And now, here was a man he had never met, doing more for him than anyone else had in years. He did not know what to say. So, he said nothing. The doctors wheeled him away, but before he disappeared through the doors, he turned one last time. Keanu was still standing there, hands in his pockets, watching him go. And in that moment, Michael realized something. Keanu was not doing this for credit. He was not doing it for cameras or headlines. He was doing it because he could. As Michael was taken into the hospital room, Keanu stood in the hallway for a moment, taking in the weight of what had just happened. The world had nearly lost another soul tonight. Another man left to freeze, forgotten by society, but not tonight. Keanu exhaled, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. He knew that in a few hours the world would carry on as if nothing had happened. Michael would wake up in a warm bed instead of a frozen sidewalk. And maybe, just maybe, this moment had changed the course of his life forever. Without waiting for recognition or thanks, Keanu turned and walked toward the exit. One life had been saved. And it had all started because one person chose to stop. Michael lay in the hospital bed, his body still aching from the brutal cold that had nearly claimed his life. The sterile scent of antiseptics filled the air, a sharp contrast to the filth and dampness he had grown accustomed to on the streets. His fingers throbbed with a painful, stinging sensation as blood circulation returned, a brutal but necessary process that reminded him he was still alive. The warmth of the blanket wrapped around him felt foreign, almost suffocating after months of exposure to the relentless winter air. His mind struggled to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. The last thing he remembered was the unbearable cold, the numbness creeping through his limbs, and the acceptance that this was how it would end. But then, against all odds, someone had stopped. Not just anyone. Keanu Reeves. The name still felt unreal. Of all the people who had walked past him, ignoring his existence like he was nothing more than a discarded piece of trash, it had been him. A world-famous actor, a man with the power to be anywhere, to do anything, who had not only noticed but had chosen to help. It made no sense. Why would someone like him stop? What had he seen that made him care when no one else had? These questions swirled in Michael's mind, unanswered and overwhelming. He had spent so long believing that he was invisible, that he no longer mattered, that help was a luxury meant for others, but never for him. And yet, here he was, alive, warm, safe. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head, expecting to see a nurse, maybe a doctor, but his breath caught when the door opened and Keanu walked in. The sight of him standing there, casual yet commanding, sent a fresh wave of disbelief through Michael. He had assumed that once he was out of immediate danger, the man who had saved him would return to his world, leaving Michael to figure out his next steps alone. But here he was, as if ensuring Michael's safety had not just been a momentary act of kindness, but a commitment he intended to follow through. Michael tried to sit up, wincing as his sore muscles protested the movement. Every part of his body ached from the months of hardship, from the cold that had nearly stolen his life, from the exhaustion that had weighed him down for far too long. Keanu stepped closer, his presence calm yet commanding, and gestured for him to take it easy. There was no rush, no pressure. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt like someone cared. He had forgotten what that felt like. "I thought you would be gone by now," Michael admitted, his voice hoarse from dehydration and exhaustion. He had learned long ago not to expect people to stay. Even those who had once been close to him had disappeared when life got hard. Keanu settled into the chair beside the bed, resting his hands on his knees, his expression thoughtful. "Figured I should check in on you." His tone was casual, almost as if they were old friends catching up instead of two strangers whose paths had crossed in the most unexpected way. Michael shook his head, still struggling to process everything. "I do not get it. Why are you doing this?" Keanu exhaled slowly, as if the answer was so simple that he barely needed to think about it. "Because I saw someone who needed help, and I could do something about it." Michael swallowed hard. The words hit him in a way he had not expected. "Because I saw you." It had been so long since anyone had truly seen him. Not as a problem to avoid, not as a stain on the city streets, not as a failure, but as a person. He had spent months convincing himself that he did not matter, that his existence was irrelevant to the world around him. And yet, here was a man who had stopped, who had pulled him from the brink of death, who was sitting beside him now as if his life was worth something after all. Michael clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as a flood of emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He had built walls around himself made of resentment, of bitterness, of the quiet acceptance that the world was cruel. But those walls were crumbling now, and he did not know how to deal with it. He exhaled shakily, his body still trembling from the after effects of hypothermia. "I do not know how to thank you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "You do not have to." There was no need for dramatics, no expectation of gratitude. Keanu had never done things for recognition. This was just who he was. Michael hesitated before speaking again. "I lost everything, my job, my home, everything. I tried to get back on my feet, but..." He stopped himself, his throat tightening. The words felt too heavy to say out loud. Keanu nodded as if he understood. And maybe he did. He had seen people fall before. had witnessed the way life could be unforgiving, how it could strip someone of everything and leave them with nothing. He had never believed in judging people for where they ended up. Life was unpredictable. Some people made it. Some people lost their way. But that did not mean they were beyond saving. A nurse knocked on the door, stepping inside with a clipboard in her hands. "Mr. Carter, your discharge papers are ready." Michael blinked in surprise. "Discharge?" He turned to Keanu, confusion written all over his face. "But Keanu stood up, adjusting his coat. "You are going to a shelter, a good one." Michael's stomach twisted. "I cannot afford that." Keanu met his gaze without hesitation. "You will not have to." Michael felt his throat tighten. He had spent so long believing that kindness was a thing reserved for others, that people like him did not get second chances. And yet, here was a man who had given him not just a warm car ride, not just a hospital visit, but a real chance at getting back on his feet. It was overwhelming. I do not know what to say," Michael admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Keanu offered a small smile. "Say you will take the second chance." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had a choice now. He could let this be just another moment of temporary relief, another fleeting act of kindness in a life full of struggle. Or he could take the chance, grab onto it with everything he had left, and try again. Keanu extended his hand. Michael stared at it for a moment before gripping it firmly. It was the strongest handshake he had experienced in years, not just in physical strength, but in meaning. As Keanu turned toward the door, he paused for just a second. "Remember, one day, someone else will need help. And when that day comes, you will know what to do." Michael watched him walk away, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt hope. Not just for the next few hours, not just for tomorrow, but for a real future. The city outside had not changed. The world had not suddenly become kinder. But for Michael Carter, everything was different now. All because one man had stopped. Michael sat in the back of the taxi, staring out at the city as it blurred past the window. The hospital bracelet still clung loosely to his wrist, a reminder of just how close he had come to not making it through the night. His hands, wrapped in fresh bandages, rested on his lap, still aching from the frostbite that had nearly taken them. He flexed his fingers carefully, relieved that the doctor had told him they would recover in time. The thought of losing them, of never being able to work again, had haunted him ever since he had been brought into the emergency room. But the thing that weighed on his mind the most was not the pain or the cold, it was Keanu Reeves. Even now, after everything that had happened, it still felt unreal. He had spent years feeling invisible, discarded, forgotten by the world. Then, in the span of a single night, someone had not only noticed him but had saved him. Someone who had no reason to help him, no obligation to care, but had chosen to anyway. It was that choice that stuck with him the most. He clenched his jaw, exhaling slowly. He had always assumed that kindness was conditional, that people only helped when there was something in it for them. But Keanu had expected nothing in return. He had done what no one else had. The taxi slowed to a stop, snapping Michael out of his thoughts. He looked up at the tall building in front of him, a modest but well-maintained shelter, far different from the overcrowded and unsafe ones he had avoided before. This was the place Keanu had arranged for him to stay, the place where he would get his second chance. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You need help getting out?" Michael shook his head. "Number, I got it." Stepping out of the car, he pulled the coat around himself tighter. The cold still bit at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the night before. He could handle this. "You really meant that?" Keanu nodded. "I always mean what I say." They sat in a quiet corner of the shelter's lounge. Keanu listened as Michael told him about his progress, about the job training, about how he was slowly starting to believe in a future again. Then Keanu did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. This might help. Michael hesitated before picking it up. His eyes widened as he read the name printed on the card. It was the contact information for a company, one that was hiring. "I know the owner," Keanu said casually. "They are looking for someone reliable. I put in a word for you." Michael's heart pounded. A job. A real shot at working again. He looked up at Keanu, overwhelmed. I do not know what to say," Keanu smiled. "Then do not say anything. Just take the chance." Michael clutched the paper in his hands, realizing that this was more than just help. This was the final push he needed. As Keanu stood to leave, Michael felt something shift inside him. For so long, he had believed that the world was cruel, that kindness was a rarity meant for others. But now he had proof that there were still good people out there, and maybe, just maybe, he could become one of them. "Keanu?" Keanu turned back. Michael swallowed hard, his voice steady for the first time in a long while. "One day when I'm back on my feet, and I'm going to do for someone else what you did for me." Keanu's expression softened and he gave a small nod. "Good." Michael watched as he walked away, disappearing into the city. But this time, Michael did not feel abandoned. He felt ready. That night, Michael sat in his room, staring at the job listing in his hands. The world had not changed overnight. There were still challenges ahead. But now, for the first time in years, he had something to hold on to. A second chance. A reason to believe in something better. All because one man had stopped. "You said, Section 5 ko 1,800 words or lines," Null guy in ChatGPT said. Michael woke up the next morning feeling something he had not felt in years. A sense of purpose. The small room he had been given at the shelter was modest, but it was his. A bed. A door that locked. A place where he could close his eyes without fear of freezing to death or being attacked in the middle of the night. That alone was a gift. But today, something even bigger waited for him. He glanced at the piece of paper on the nightstand, the contact Keanu had given him for a potential job. His heart pounded as he picked it up, tracing his fingers over the name. For so long, he had believed that no one would ever give him another chance. Now, he had one. As he got dressed, he felt the weight of that opportunity settle in his chest. He had spent so long being treated like an outsider that the idea of stepping back into the world, of working again, of proving that he was still worth something, both thrilled and terrified him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had come too far to back out now. The shelter had provided him with clean clothes for the interview, and as he looked at himself in the small bathroom mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. The scruffy beard was gone. His face, though still gaunt, looked healthier than it had in months. His hands, once shaking from hunger and cold, felt steady. He still carried the weight of his past, but for the first time it did not feel like a burden dragging him down. It felt like a reminder of how far he had come. Stepping out of the shelter, the cold air nipped at his skin, but it no longer felt like an enemy. The city bustled around him as he walked toward the address on the paper, his heart racing with every step. He had no idea if he would get the job, but just the fact that he was trying again felt like a victory in itself. The building was a sleek, modern office, far different from the places he had been forced to frequent in the past year. He hesitated at the entrance, his fingers tightening around the paper in his hand. What if they saw him the way everyone else had? What if they took one look at his past and decided he was not worth the risk? Doubt crept into his mind, whispering that he did not belong here. But then, he thought about Keanu, about the moment he had stopped, the moment he had chosen to help instead of walking away. If he had believed in Michael, then maybe, just maybe, Michael could believe in himself. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The receptionist looked up and gave him a polite smile. "Can I help you?" I have an appointment," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. He gave her the name Keanu had written down, and she nodded, typing something into her computer before gesturing toward a small waiting area. Minutes felt like hours as he sat there, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. Then a man stepped out of an office, scanning the room before his eyes landed on Michael. He extended a hand, his expression unreadable. "You must be Michael Carter. I am James. Come on in." Michael stood, shaking the man's hand, and followed him inside. The office was simple but professional, the kind of place Michael had once worked in before life had unraveled. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. James gestured for him to sit. "Keanu spoke highly of you." Michael blinked. That alone was shocking. He did? James nodded. "Said you were hardworking, that you just need a chance to prove yourself." He leaned back in his chair, studying Michael carefully. "So, tell me, why should I hire you?" Michael knew this was his moment. He had no polished resume, no recent references, no way to spin his past into something glamorous. But what he did have was the truth. "Because I know what it is like to lose everything," he said, his voice steady. "I know what it is like to be counted out, to feel like the world has forgotten about you. And I know what it is like to fight your way back. I do not take second chances for granted, sir. If you give me this job, I will prove that I am worth it." James sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the desk. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Keanu was right about you." He pulled a folder from his desk and slid it across the table. "You start Monday." Michael's breath hitched. He stared at the folder, barely believing what he was seeing. He had expected rejection. He had prepared for disappointment. But here it was, a job, a real job, a way back. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. James smiled. "Do not thank me. Just show up and work hard." Michael nodded, gripping the folder tightly as he stood. His legs felt shaky as he walked out of the office, but not from fear this time, from relief, from something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. As he stepped back outside, the city felt different. The cold no longer felt like it was swallowing him whole. The streets no longer felt like traps waiting to consume him. For the first time in years, he had direction. He had a future. That evening, he sat in his small room at the shelter, staring at the job paperwork in his hands. He ran his fingers over the paper, still struggling to believe it was real. He thought about Keanu, about the moment he had stopped that night. If he had not, Michael would not be here. He would not have made it. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, hesitating for only a moment before writing. "Keanu, I do not know if you will ever read this, but I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for saving my life that night, but for believing in me when no one else did. I start my new job on Monday. I am going to make the most of this chance. I swear it. One day, when I can, I will do the same for someone else. Because now I know how much one act of kindness can change a life. Thank you. Michael Carter." He folded the paper carefully, deciding he would ask the shelter director if he could send it. Keanu had never asked for thanks, had never expected recognition. But Michael needed him to know that his actions had changed everything. As he lay down that night, he did not feel the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. He did not feel the despair that had clung to him for so long. Instead, he felt something new, a future, a purpose, a second chance. And it had all started because one man had chosen to stop. Michael woke up on Monday morning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness coursing through his veins. The sun filtered through the small window in his shelter room, casting a golden glow on the walls. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with everything that had led to this moment. Today was his first day at his new job, a real job, a second chance, a life that just a few weeks ago had felt impossible. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair as the reality of his situation sank in. This was not a dream. He was no longer lying in a frozen alley, waiting for the cold to claim him. He was no longer invisible, forgotten by the world. He had a path forward now, and all because one man had stopped, had noticed, had cared. Keanu Reeves. The name still carried a weight he could not quite process. Taking a deep breath, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for the clean clothes neatly folded on his chair. They were simple, a button-down shirt, a pair of slacks, and sturdy shoes, but to him, they felt like armor. A uniform of dignity. For the first time in a long time, he was stepping back into the world as a man with purpose. As he walked through the shelter's halls, he exchanged quiet nods with other residents, many of whom had come from similar struggles. Some had been there longer than him, still trying to find their way, still hoping for a break. Others had already moved on, proof that this place was not a dead end, but a beginning. Daniel, the shelter director, spotted him near the entrance and gave him a warm smile. "Big day?" Michael nodded, gripping the straps of the old but sturdy bag slung over his shoulder. "Yeah, feels surreal." Daniel patted his shoulder. "That feeling will pass. Once you settle in, once you get used to the rhythm again, you will see. It is just like riding a bike. You never really forget how to move forward." Michael exhaled, appreciating the words more than he could express. "Thanks for everything." Daniel gave him a knowing look. "No need to thank me, son. Just make the most of it." With that, Michael stepped out into the crisp morning air, his breath forming small clouds as he exhaled. The city felt different today. The streets, once overwhelming and hostile, now felt like a place of possibility. He was not just existing anymore, he was living. The subway ride to his new job was a blur of faces, conversations, and the distant hum of city life. He had not taken public transportation in so long that he almost felt out of place, but he reminded himself this was where he belonged now. Among people, not on the outskirts, not hidden in alleyways or beneath cardboard boxes. When he arrived at the office building, he paused outside for a moment, staring up at the towering structure. This was real. He had been given a chance, and he was going to prove that he deserved it. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the receptionist, who remembered him from his interview. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said with a smile. "Your supervisor will be here shortly to show you around." He had forgotten what it felt like to be addressed with respect, to be seen as someone who belonged. He nodded. He ordered a simple black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world move around him. Then, as if fate had a way of tying things together, his phone buzzed with a message. It was a number he did not recognize. "Heard you had your first day today. How did it go?" Michael stared at the screen for a moment before realization struck. Keanu. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed back. "It went well. Better than I expected. Thank you. For everything." A few moments later, a response came. "You did the hard part. I just helped you find the path." Michael exhaled, shaking his head with a small laugh. Of course Keanu would say that. He hesitated for a moment before typing again. "One day I am going to do what you did for me." This time the response came almost instantly. "Good. That is how kindness works. Pass it on." Michael locked his phone, staring out the window, his mind swirling with everything that had led him here. One person had stopped. One act of kindness had changed everything. And now, it was his turn. One act of kindness can change the course of a person's life forever. Keanu Reeves did not just save Michael from the cold, he gave him hope, a second chance, and a reason to believe in humanity again. But kindness is not about fame or recognition. It is about choosing to see the people the world ignores, about stepping in when others turn away. How many people do we pass by every day who need help? How often do we assume someone else will step in? What if that someone is you? Because sometimes the smallest act, a warm meal, a kind word, a moment of acknowledgement can be the difference between despair and hope, between giving up and holding on. You do not have to be famous to make a difference. You just have to care. And when that moment comes, when you see someone in need, will you be the one to stop?